Good evening, everyone. Happy New Year and welcome back to 5 by 15. We're kicking off our new season tonight with a very special event about psychedelics, consciousness, and how we experience the world. And it's my absolute pleasure to introduce our two speakers. Andy Mitchell is a neuropsychologist and therapist. He is specialized in treating patients with rare brain conditions, head injuries, and epilepsy, and in the application of mindfulness for neurological patients. As a therapist, he's worked with people with a range of mental health disorders. In his acclaimed new book, 10 Trips, which we'll be speaking about this evening, he makes the case for psychedelics as a way to re-enchant us with the world. Andy is joined this evening by Anil Seth, a leading British researcher in the field of consciousness science. He is Professor of Cognitive and Computational Neuroscience at the University of Sussex, and his writing has appeared in The Guardian, New Scientist, Scientific American, and Granta. In his latest book, Being You, he offers a radical new theory of the self. So, get ready to have your minds expanded this evening. And remember that you can order copies of both 10 Trips and Being You from our independent bookseller, Newham Bookshop. Please post your questions for Andy and Anil this evening in the Zoom Q&A box, and they'll get to as many as they can in the latter part of our discussion. That just leaves me to say a very warm welcome to Andy and Anil. Welcome.
Thank you, Jack, and hello, everybody, wherever you are, behind there somewhere. Yeah, I've been really looking forward to this too. So I've very much enjoyed reading Andy's book, 10 Trips, which has been described by me, it seems, as an incisive, deeply personal and beautifully written account of the power, the uses and the modern misuses of psychedelics. Highly recommended, which it is. So it's been really fun to have the chance to go through it again. So how we're going to do this, I think, is we're going to talk to each other for a little bit and then open it up to Q&A. Is that right, Andy?
That sounds great. Yeah. Thanks, Anil, and hi to everyone.
So I think that how we decided we wanted to start this is we've both ended up writing books about consciousness with a kind of emphasis on the nature of experience as well, rather than necessarily other things. And it was, Jack mentioned, Andy, that you have a background as a neuropsychologist as well. And then, this extraordinary tour of different kinds of psychedelics in all sorts of different settings. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about how you got into this, what your trajectory has been.
Well, I've just about 20 years ago, I stopped taking drugs altogether. I fell foul of overconsumption in various ways, and it just didn't suit me. And so relatively happily for the last 20 years, I've lived a drug-free life. And as people will no doubt know, the ideas of set and setting are quite important to one's experience of psychedelics. And so,
do you just mean by drug-free? Do you mean are you including like alcohol and caffeine? And I mean, how do you?
Yeah,
how drug-free was your drug-freeness?
Definitely alcohol. Mm-hmm. So alcohol and drugs went to get recreational drugs went together for me. I worked in the film industry, and it was just part and parcel of that lifestyle. And so I drew a line under it. Shortly after that, I started reading Oliver Sacks and, in fact, Gerald Edelman, who I think you worked with. And I got sucked into neuroscience and worked in clinical health and then in clinical neurology and neurosurgery for a number of years. And I kept an eye on psychedelic research. And I suppose my set around psychedelics was initially one of sort of mild skepticism. And I think sort of philosophically, I think of the great framing narrative for the background narrative for our existence at the moment is climate change. And having worked in mental health for a number of years and seen the sort of state of psychiatry and the lack of neuropharmacological innovation, the sometimes marginal efficacy of psychotherapy, to see psychedelics arrive center stage as an antidote that was achieving remarkable results, and that this antidote was somehow green and organic and has been part of our biosphere and Gaia and such like. It raised my skepticism. So I began to look at the literature, and I could see that there was, there was definitely hopeful things happening, but I wanted to sort of take a deep dive into it. And I think one thing that I thought was that, and this is sort of, first of all, that psychedelics were a test case for what science does to something, and how science and its research proclivities, its limits of research, its overlap, particularly with drugs, with money, on the one hand, how that happens. And then on the other hand, how broadly as a culture, what we do with new things, and how we kind of are just inevitably want solutions, quick solutions to problems, and to what extent psychedelics might fall into those kind of pitfalls. And so I'd written a couple of books on neurology, and I pitched to my publisher that I would just dive in. I've got a sort of I don't know. I just like the idea of rather quixotic journeys. So I took a sabbatical and set the book up as taking 10 different substances in 10 different contexts, so that I could survey all of the different nuanced models for psychedelic consumption and participation. And so that was the sort of genesis of the idea, and then the book was the outcome.
So the book it's more than a tour of different tasting menu of psychedelics, and perhaps more than a skeptical take on how the psychedelic industry is being developed. But would it be right to say it's sort of using what's happening in psychedelics now as a way of performing a social commentary on how we make new things, make use of new things?
Exactly.
Or make use again of old things, or repurpose old things in new ways.
Repurpose old things, and the role of science in that, particularly the role of science in that narrative, and what science does to other forms of expression and modes of culture, and what our Western notions of science and Western expression does to other cultures, etc. And just how psychedelics seems to bring together. It's a crossroads for different ways of speaking about the world, or for speaking about notions of health or illness, and how it sort of therefore contains all the idioms we have for taking ourselves both too seriously and not seriously enough. So that was the kind of dual access point for it.
And is science responsible for that? Is science the sort of established cultural process we have that leads us to take ourselves too seriously and not seriously enough? Or what else is science doing? What is it that shows up when you look at science through the lens of psychedelics rather than the other way around, which is what typically people do?
Well, I think there's some irony that that a type of science has led the way in repurposing psychedelics. In that, science is just, is frankly is the de facto rational, is the thing that separates us from the animals more than anything else. It's the seat of our reason. Its principles are unchallenged and unchallengeable at their root. And yet there's something about psychedelics that's saying, in order to unstick ourselves from our own individual reasoning, we have to experience some form of insanity, some form of derangement, some form of our fragility in the face of our best efforts to navigate the world. So there's something, at the most literal level, counter reasonable about it.
Interesting. So you think there is a shared feature across psychedelics of it's introducing some kind of temporary derangement and temporary
it's definitely
insanity.
got that aspect to it. And, you know, and I think that's, I mean, science can accommodate that for sure. And I think, you know, your book, which had a big influence on me at the time that I read it a couple of years ago, just shows what a lucid grounding in not knowing, and added with curiosity about phenomenology, how far that can take you through the kind of towards deconstructing some of the fortresses that science, or the ideology of science, creates for itself around something like consciousness. Well, consciousness is the sort of de facto thing. It's the last quixotic thing that, you know, science has set for itself. And
I think there's a key word that came up there in what you just said, which was phenomenology, right? So phenomenology being, well, as far as I understand it, the study of experience itself, you know, rather than other things. And this comes through very strongly in your book, is the phenomenological aspects, the phenomenological properties across the different kinds of experiences. I wonder if you could say a bit more about that.
Yeah, I mean, so my background, before I got into science, my background was in literature and philosophy. And I think I came to see psychedelic experiences really as sort of, it sounds so pretentious, but as to kind of sort of art forms that the normally under-experienced parts of the brain is capable of laying out for us in ways that are just, by definition, shocking, surprising, beautiful, to the point that I could, being kind of deeply agnostic myself, I could feel the pull of wanting to attribute the masterliness and the artfulness of some of these experiences to something beyond the brain. And it was no surprise to me to meet, as I traveled the world, people who had gone all the way and gone from agnosticism to forms of animism, particularly forms of animism and belief in the trees, or belief in weather systems, or belief in cultures they'd never experienced before, you know, adopting their belief. And to me, that's really what, in a way, so I can't remember who it was that said that poems poems are where we go to. The received thing is that poems are where we go to for wisdom, and psychedelics are where we go. Therefore, psychedelics are where we go to for wisdom. But for me, poems and psychedelics are where we go to deconstruct wisdom, to disabuse wisdom in some way, to see how our brains can put things together, and we will then fill in something sort of remarkably artistic around it. To shape our psyches.
To look under the hood a little bit, so to speak.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
And do you think the fact that a number of the people that you've met were drawn away from agnosticism or even atheism towards some forms of animism, is that attributable to the specific kinds of phenomenology that are associated with the psychedelics that they were taking, or the psychedelics in the cultural context setting?
I think it's, I mean, I haven't studied it formally, but I think the number of people that I met that would say that they met some kind of entity that was separate from themselves, and that entity then told them about the secrets of the universe or what they should do with the rest of their lives. And by and large, that, you know, they, as far as they were concerned, they were now adhering to that. And I think there's been studies in the last couple of years looking at how people shift metaphysical, or can shift metaphysical positions on the basis of taking psychedelics.
And that's right. Yeah, Chris Letheby, I think, has done some of these studies, right?
Chris Letheby's done it. And I think, you know, that as a clinician, that has some implications for if these are ever to be used routinely in the British healthcare, then we've got to do due diligence with informed consent, etc. Then that needs to be built into what we're telling our patients about the possible consequences of psychedelic experiences.
Right, you might end up believing something completely different about the nature of the universe.
Yeah, you might be. Yeah, right. At what cost are you cured of your depression?
Yeah, yeah. But that's interesting. I mean, I think it's a fascinating question about how people's metaphysical beliefs, which is to say, sort of, beliefs about the relationship between consciousness and the material world, or the existence of, some higher powers and things like that. How does that change? I mean, I remember in my experiences, it sort of went the other way around. Sort of like, well, the experiences I've had under psychedelics, which are far fewer than yours, far less varied as well, I think, are, well, that's exactly what I would expect to happen if my conscious experiences were generated by the brain, and you start screwing around with that process. I was reminded of there are ways, for instance, in which you can induce out of body experiences. I mean, sometimes this can happen in psychedelics, but it can also happen, in other situations, like through brain stimulation in particular ways. Some people would say even through virtual reality, though I'm not quite sure it's the same thing. And of course, you can have the experience of being outside your body and maybe looking at it, and you can draw two diametrically opposite conclusions from that experience. One could be, well, I take my experience not only seriously but also literally. So because I experience myself as outside of my body, consciousness can leave the body and move around. Or you could say, I take my experience seriously but not literally. And so you come to the conclusion that, the first person perspective that I've always taken for granted is something that the brain is always under the hood, just cobbling together. And you can, if you screw around with that process, you screw around with that aspect of your experience. So it becomes, in a sense, it smuggles in even a deeper materialism, because it might reveal aspects of your phenomenology that you hadn't considered even required a material basis. So I guess my prior as a neuroscientist meant I was more susceptible to taking something like a psychedelic experience and, in a sort of confirmation bias way, finding in that further evidence for a materialist metaphysics. But it seems that most people indeed go the other way. They
right. And I can, I think that's right. I suppose there are moments, like an out-of-body experience or an entity speaking. There are moments that one can understand within the terms of neuroscience quite easily, in the way that you say, is within a physicalist tradition. I suppose the thing that is most seductive to me, though, is that, say there's 500 people talk about a trip being a good trip or a bad trip, but really, just like perception itself, it's made up of a gazillion different bits of information that are smoothed over into one or several narratives. And I think that the most astonishing thing is that when one is the sense that, taken together as a whole, the trip can feel like it's been put together by a master orchestrator, that it couldn't have been put together in any other way. That all billion bits are pointing to many different insights that that are adducible and that weren't adducible before that moment. And it's very, very difficult to resist the urge then, for me even, to want to say that there are mysteries to the brain, that just at least to come up with that kind of low-level agnostic mysticism and say there are things about the brain that are just, staggering in their capacities to astonish us. What do you think of that?
Well, the idea that there's a space for mystery still.
There's a space for mystery, and there's a space that somehow the greatest work of art might be just the way that perceptions are being arranged at any given moment. That life itself, as Hamlet says, I think, life is the slow artist. We could never make it up.
Yeah, I'm very sympathetic to that. I was just thinking as well about this, what you were saying about the sort of the significance a well orchestrated psychedelic experience seems to have, like the fact that that it seems to be pointing to something, it seems to be laden with salience, and just wondering whether that's actually because of the content of the psychedelic experiences, or whether it's just another aspect of the general phenomenology that things have a salience, much as in and of course originally psychedelics were described as psychomimetic substances because they were was argued that they mimicked forms of psychosis, and I think that idea has rightly been fallen a bit by the wayside. But one aspect where there might be similarities is in this feeling of great significance to everything, because that can be quite common in psychosis as well, can't it?
Yeah, right. I suppose that, yeah, I suppose I can accept that to a point, but if take for example the sort of tradition of psychedelics and nature, rather than psychedelics as studied in the lab, it's psychedelics taken in a forest, or psychedelics looking at a grassy field. And there's something about, and I think different psychedelics have different qualities in this regard, but if you're looking out across a field of swaying grass, then normally, if you're not a poet, you might say, oh, well, I can see that this looks somewhat like the sea. But it seems that psychedelics open up every single metaphorical portal of what grass moving through the wind looks like, that it's all there all the time in normal perception. It's available in normal perception, but psychedelics just allow it to be framed sort of synchronously at the same, so that you're seeing all these possibilities at the same time. I'm not, it's a sort of platonic psychedelic trip.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that echoes the more literal meaning of the word psychedelic, doesn't it? Which is mind manifesting. So there are these aspects of our perception, or what our brain is likely doing all the time, that in normal perception don't, either they sort of skate below our attention or skate below our cognitive access, or just skate below our conscious perception. They don't become manifest in phenomenology.
Right.
So I think that does make a lot of sense, and of course that resonates with a lot of other observations about psychedelics, that they sort of involve a certain amount of synesthesia too. There's a lot of mixing of the senses, which is if you think of it, that's almost a precondition for metaphor, right?
Right, exactly. Yeah,
that we're looking for this crosstalk between the senses. But I didn't mean to swerve your question earlier about the quote from Hamlet. I can't remember what it was now, but I think for me that the one of the great things that psychedelics allows us to see, and in fact the thing that studying consciousness from whatever perspective reveals, whether it's through psychedelics or in my most of my work is just normally in the lab doing other kinds of boring experiments and such like, is it does reveal how extraordinary our everyday experience is, because it's so easy to take it for granted. And you wake up in the morning and you open your eyes and there's the world. And it doesn't seem like anything particularly dramatic or remarkable is going on. But of course, what's happening is this everyday, almost miracle of your brain creating the subjective experience of a world and of a self from noisy and ambiguous sensory electrical signals, which are only ever indirectly related to things which we'll never have direct perception of anyway. It's always a construction. So this is another thing actually I've been interested in about psychedelics. There's again, I think, two views. One is that a little bit like what you were saying, psychedelics almost it takes away the filters. It allows us to see what we would not normally see. And if you push that view to an extreme, it can be said that psychedelics allows you to see reality more as it is than in the blinkered, filtered way that we often do. But then the other way to think of it is that it doesn't allow us to see reality more as it is. In fact, our everyday perception is probably geared to objective reality in ways that are more robust, from a sort
Right.
of survival-oriented perspective.
Right.
But what psychedelics does show is that itself is still a kind of construction.
Yeah.
That it reveals that all of our perceptual experiences are works of art by the brain for the brain.
Right. I think in Being You or elsewhere, you've described yourself as a physicalist, but agnostic with regards to what?
The truth, I suppose, the ultimate way. I mean, yes. So I do describe myself as a sort of pragmatic materialist physicalist, by which I mean that materialism, physicalism, I'll use the two synonymously here, is basically the idea that objective reality exists. There is stuff, exactly what this stuff is. Who really knows? Best ask a physicist. It's complicated out there. But there is stuff independently of our conscious experiences of anything. So there was stuff before there were subjects or any organism that had any experience, and that consciousness is somehow a property of stuff organized and interacting in particular ways. So I mean, this is set in contrast to idealism, which is the idea that the primary mode of existence is consciousness or mind, and stuff is a sort of reflection of that. Or panpsychism, the other sort of, which has been getting a lot more play recently, people like Philip Goff, which is that no, there's stuff, but there's also consciousness. Consciousness is also fundamental.
Yeah.
Which is a view I don't find particularly useful. It's not that it's obviously wrong. It just doesn't really help. And so that explains why I'm a sort of pragmatic materialist, because I find it the most useful core assumption to make when trying to understand things about consciousness.
Yeah.
And of course, materialism has been a very productive philosophy that's driven scientific insights over hundreds of years. It doesn't mean it's fundamentally right. It may be that materialism will fall short of explaining how and why consciousness is part of the universe. But it hasn't fallen short. Just because it hasn't got there yet doesn't mean it's necessarily going to fail.
Yeah.
And it's still, I think, is our best current bet, because it generates testable hypotheses that have explanatory and predictive power, and that's what we need. And then it's an open question. Will it fail? Will we need recourse to some other metaphysics? Well, I don't know. I mean, there's a long way to go. The brain is complicated and matter itself is extremely complicated. So the resources of materialism have not been exhausted by any means, I don't think.
I mean, do you think there's anything about the Renaissance in psychedelics overlaps because there's such high profile interest in consciousness these days?
I mean, the
second part of that would be: is there anything special about psychedelics in what it might contribute to furthering the understanding of consciousness?
I think for sure let's think about both. So there's been an interesting sort of historical synchronicity or parallel between the study of consciousness in general and the rehabilitation or renaissance of psychedelics. So, for a lot of the 20th century, it was pretty illegitimate to study consciousness within neuroscience and psychology. It'd been ostracized arguably because it is difficult. It's a topic that has unique difficulties because the thing you're trying to study is intrinsically private and subjective, and has this air of metaphysical mystery about it as well. But on the other hand, it is perfectly possible to study consciousness. I mean, has the great advantage of being human scale, realized in billions of different instances, and available right here, right now. I think of some of the other grand mysteries of like what happened at the Big Bang. That's very far away, very long ago. Can't intervene on it. Very difficult to study. Or quantum, what's the nature of objective reality? How do we understand quantum mechanics? Very, very small, very hard to do. Brains are human size and you can put them in scanners. And so it's fantastically easy in that way. So it's possible to study consciousness. And it just took a long time for it to regain its lost legitimacy. And part of that same trajectory, I think, happened with psychedelics, but for somewhat different reasons, right? I mean, there was a hugely political angle to why psychedelics were suppressed for so long. And the resurgence in consciousness science, I think, predated the renaissance of psychedelics, probably by a decade or two, maybe.
Sure.
But there is now a synergy between them, because it comes back to the mind manifesting property. I mean, if you think about how one might want to study consciousness, well, one of the things researchers like me always try to do, or find ways to do, is intervene. You want to change the system and change experience. And of course, psychedelics do this. You give somebody a small amount of a particular chemical compound, and their experiences change so dramatically in much more radical ways than is possible using most of the methods that we have in psychology labs, where you can say, oh, like you saw some dots going left or some dots going right. I mean, great. You can learn a lot that way, but you're not deconstructing how, the sort of structural aspects of how consciousness unfolds in general. You're not unpacking the structure of consciousness very much, but psychedelics can do that in a controllable way. And of course, you can, as people like Robin Carhart-Harris have done, you can put people in brain imaging and begin to connect the dots and begin to understand what's happening in the brain globally. Because we know very well, for many psychedelics, what happens at the chemical level. LSD, psilocybin bind to serotonin receptors. And we know where those serotonin receptors are. It's very well understood. But the gap between knowing that and understanding how and why our experience changes so dramatically, that's where I think the action and the opportunity is. What's happening at a whole brain level that can account for these changes. So it's a very, very powerful tool for consciousness research, completely independently of any of this therapeutic value, which I think we should talk about a little bit as well, because I think this is central aspect of your book. I mean, I think your book is a brilliant sequel to Michael Pollan's How to Change Your Mind, which seemed to be a book about, was it 10 years ago now? Was it already?
It was 2018, so just
not
over
that long
5
ago,
years
actually.
ago. Yeah, coming up to 6 years.
Okay, I mean, that really seemed to catalyze a much more widespread interest in psychedelics outside of specific communities, and probably did a lot to kickstart a lot of what we might now call the psychedelic industry.
Yeah, I think there's even something in psychedelic research called the controlling for the Michael Pollan effect. I think one problem with psychedelic research, clinical research, is that people's expectation of healing is so strong, and Michael Pollan is comically responsible for kickstarting that snowball. That it's the clinical research faces the task of how to mask. You can't mask psychedelics, but how can you mute people's expectancies about change? Because for example, recently some of the attempts to show the efficacy of microdosing in particular have not really crossed the threshold of placebo, and there's a lot of debate about how strong the placebo is in more macro doses as well. And I mean, at least when I first started digging around in a couple of years ago, there was just such a strong wish amongst the psychedelic research community for psychedelics to work. And that's really understandable, because so little has worked pharmacologically for people struggling with mental health diagnoses. And I think that as a consequence of that, some of the research that was done just made too larger claims on too smaller effect sizes. To my mind, from this vantage point, after having written the book, I think there's no doubt that psychedelics can have a transformative effect on some people. How long that lasts and the nature of that transformation is still too early to say. But I still think that for many people, who are struggling with long-term, severe and enduring mental health diagnoses, psychedelics are not going to change the material circumstances of their life or the materiality of their brain in significant ways. I think there's been over claims for that with psychedelics.
So you think the pendulum might have swung too far the other way?
I think it's beginning to. I mean, apart from the fact that it's now a multi-billion-dollar industry, I think there is more realism about caution in terms of making claims about what works for whom. And there's so. I mean, I think we're talking about the clinical research, but there's so little been. And I know Robin Carhart Harris and others have done a lot about brain imaging, but there's still a lot to be done in terms of mapping the phenomenology scientifically. And that's what's always impressed me about your work. It's been so phenomenologically curious. And I think that there's very little been done there's so much that could be done and so little that has been done thus far. And I suppose just to tack a little bit, and I was reading recently, and I covered it briefly in the book, about some virtual reality software called Isness Distributed, which gives people psychedelic-like experiences, usually in groups. And the verisimilitude of the experience is so strong that the effect sizes of spiritual experiences and ego death is at least as strong as psychedelics. So there's obviously something beyond the neuropharmacology of it. And that made me think of your involvement with the Dream Machine, which people may not be familiar with. Would you just say a little about that, Anil?
Sure. So, the Dream Machine was a public art science project. You went to it, Andy, didn't you? Yeah.
I did, yeah.
Yeah, which ran in 2022. I keep wanting to say last year, but it's now in 2022. And it's based on a very simple technique to induce visual hallucinations. And the simple technique is using bright stroboscopic light on closed eyes. So the fact that this generates visual hallucinations had been known since the late 1950s, discovered sort of jointly by Gray Walter, who was one of the pioneers, a crazy kind of British polymath, neuroscientist, bomb disposal expert, wife swapper, kite surfer, all kinds of crazy things he did. And he noticed that bright lights flickering very fast with closed eyes gave rise to experiences of colors and shapes and sometimes more complicated things as well. And he has a beautiful chapter in his 1953 book called Revelation by Flicker, where he talks about this. And then there was a Beat Generation artist, Brian Geisen, who came up with the word Dream Machine, and he basically built a low-tech version of this, which was a bright light suspended above a turntable, and there was like some cardboard cutout with slits in that gave a stroboscopic effect when the turntable rotated. So he made these Dream Machines, and he wanted to commercialize them actually and sort of make them very, very widely available. But for various hilarious reasons, that didn't work out. And so it was kind of forgotten about, this Dream Machine thing. And in my lab, we got interested in it about 10 years ago, more now, I think, when we saw some Austrian company visiting and they'd brought this strobe setup. And I was very skeptical. I didn't think it was going to work at all. But it really did. You sit in front of this powerful strobe light and you get vivid, for me, really deep, saturated, oversaturated, hypersaturated colors and fast-changing geometric patterns. I think it's fascinating because the light is just white. So there's an interesting dissociation between the stimulus and the phenomenology again. So this was something we were doing in the back burner for ages, but then the opportunity came up through, again, various hilarious reasons involving Brexit, surprisingly, to develop the Dream Machine as a collective experience for thousands of people. So we did this in collaboration with the musician John Hopkins and some architects, Assemble Collective, and built Dream Machines which housed basically 20 or 30 people at a time would go in, experience this stroboscopically driven hallucinatory journey, and then come out into a reflection area and sort of think about what they experienced, talk to each other, write about it, and so on. And overall, we had about 40,000 people through the Dream Machine in London, Belfast, Edinburgh, and Cardiff in 2022. And we're hoping to sort of take it on tour. But what's super, we were very, very careful not to describe it as a psychedelic experience, partly for this expectation thing. But of course, as soon as anyone saw it, they immediately said, like, the Guardian review was something like, "This is as close to psychedelic trip, government funded psychedelic trip as you ever get." It was like that was the knee jerk response to it, which of course then feeds back to people's expectations. In my own sort of introspective analysis, the experience in the Dream Machine is very, very different from a psychedelic experience. It has in common that it's not normal. It has in common that you're having an experience which seems to be somehow internally generated, but beyond that, the specific details are very different. But just to sort of close the loop on this, one of the things we want to do is look at the potential efficacy of this in treatment of things like depression. We had a lot of anecdotal reports from people saying how it helped them with depression. Again, we made no claims or promises about this at all. This could be just because it was a very nice thing to do. I mean, the whole setup was nicely designed and you were well looked after. So it could just be, you go somewhere, you have an unexpectedly nice time, you feel better. But there might be, the thing we want to just examine a bit more closely. And I have no, I don't know how it will turn out at all. But it could be that there's a shared sort of antidepressant mechanism between something like Dream Machine and psychedelics, which is the breaking yourself out of your normal perceptual habit. And if you're able to directly experience your brain as the source of experience itself, which both the Dream Machine and psychedelics can do, maybe that is the sort of the common mechanistic pathway, which is amusingly, it's totally the opposite to what some companies are doing in the States, which is trying to develop non-psychedelic psychedelics where they preserve something of the pharmacological effect, but totally try and get rid of any experiential effects, so it'll be easier to get through regulation and so on. So if you've got these two interesting things. We're betting on it's the experience that matters, not the pharmacological mechanism. And then you have these other people saying exactly the opposite. Of course, you might need both for real change.
But at a material level, at the level of the brain, could both of those possibilities look the same?
Well, the strobe light is, it may, there may be brain, it will be having, there's certainly something it's doing to the brain because your experience is changing.
That's what I mean. I suppose, given that a lot of the research, the clinical research and the neuroscientific research is pointing to, has had this sort of magical, referring to synaptogenesis as the sort of, as the key. I mean, presumably both of those routes could lead to synaptogenesis, identical synaptogenesis.
Possibly. I doubt it'd be identical. I think there's a couple of animal models, people doing strobe lights on mice and things, showing potentially some increased plasticity, so that the brain becomes a bit more changeable. But I think it would be very different. For instance, one of the things about psychedelics is there seems to be quite an extended window post psychedelic, post the acute period of administration, where the brain is more changeable. I very much doubt that would be the case in the strobe light thing. It's also, it's very constricted. The light starts, your experience changes, and the light stops, you're straight back. So it's very temporally circumscribed. But there could be. So this is something we want to look further into what's happening in the brain in the moment and later on. But it's a surprisingly simple way of inducing an altered experience.
And I think I'm right. Yeah. I experienced it at the very end of my research, and I'd done way too many trips in too short a time. And so for me, the experience, whilst very interesting, was on the mild end of the spectrum. But I think I'm right in saying is that you were health and safety concerns restricted you to certain narrow parameters with your equipment.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. So when we were developing, we ought to move on to the Q&A in a second, actually. But yeah, when we were developing it, we had the luxury of just being able to sort of experiment on ourselves and do more or less what we wanted.
Right.
And yeah, so there are versions of it which are much less mild.
Okay.
Okay. So I think, in the interest of time, we've ended up. This was always going to happen. We've got a ton of questions. I hadn't seen a lot of them come in, so I'm just going to skate quickly through them and just see if there are any that are roughly the same. Well, let me just start. While I look at them, I'm just going to punt one to you, Andy, that came up early that I'd seen already, which is a common question, I think. So it's from anonymous attendee, and it's asking, how addictive are psychedelics? Is there a danger prescribing them to those who struggle with addiction?
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, they're being reused now as treatments for addiction, and I think at the physiological level, they're found to be robustly non-addictive. I would say that at a behavioral level, I've met people that clinically I'm circumspect because these people seem to be very dependent on using psychedelics. And, psychedelics have taken a niche in their lives, which you might think of as they're somewhat over-reliant on psychedelic experiences psychologically. But in terms of traditional definitions of addiction, no, I think they're sort of robustly non-addictive.
Yeah, that's. I mean, I think there's I think I've noticed something similar. It's sort of a meta level of addiction, isn't it? Where people come to rely on the psychedelic intervention to sort of fix them for a while, but it's not a permanent fix. So then they end up going back for more.
That might be important for clinical research, because there's been a lot of talk, as you say, about this synaptic window that's open for a few weeks, but no one's really sure how robust the changes are after that. And it may be that the fact that certain people are having to take them an awful lot to get where they want to go experientially, that might be an important piece of research to be done.
Okay, so there's one very quick question from Thomas Pack, which I thought was first an insult to my coherence, which says, Anil Seth, what are you drinking? But I think it's actually it's beetroot juice. It's almost gone. Just so people know, beetroot juice. Question from Charles Kingsmill. He said, Anil outlined the idea of everyday consciousness being filtered or calibrated to offer evolutionary survival value, presumably at the individual level. Was Andy suggesting that psychedelics can offer survival value at a grander scale, humanity, planetary health? How might that work? Is there a survival value, evolutionary story to tell?
Well, I'm not going to make that claim personally, and that, in fact, it was that slight framing of things in terms of ecological consciousness that was one of the things that contributed to my skepticism, that here was a green alternative to SSRIs that could bring us to a shared understanding of what we were doing to ourselves and to our planet. That seemed to be somehow built into at least certain aspects of the psychedelic experience. And I think that it's probably more likely statistically that psychedelics will just illustrate what our treatment and use and commercialization of psychedelics are more likely to illustrate what a mess we're in. But that doesn't denounce that they have this tremendous potential to shed light on our interdependence. That's definitely the case. But how we build that into the materiality of our lives is not going to be resolved by psychedelics.
Maybe a related question from anonymous again is, you do talk about this in your book, and we've talked about it a bit today already, but maybe it's about what are your thoughts on capitalism and psychedelics? Not so much from a science medicine point of view, but the use, misuse, exploitation of traditions from non-capitalist cultures, like e.g. tech bros on ayahuasca. What's going on there?
Yeah, I think that's what when I talk about how psychedelics might show us what a mess we're in, it's exactly that kind of thing, that we've taken this sort of precious tradition, these precious medicines, that some of which have a history of thousands of years. We found them to be useful to treat certain conditions that are very modern and very, very much to do with what it's like to be an individual in capitalist society. And now we've kind of created, or in danger of creating, a kind of Disneyland, a real comic book mess out of these, without any kind of sense of tradition or ritual or care for where they've come from.
Mm-hmm. Is it, I mean, you say in your book, you have this very nice phrase of instrumentalizing of experience. Is that what you're talking about here, or is that something else?
Well, I think that's definitely part. I think that's definitely part. I mean, that's definitely part of a tendency that we have to create. That psychedelics just become the latest biohack by which we recreate or optimize, or just a more elaborate way of plugging into entertainment.
Mm-hmm.
And they outside of a clinical sphere, they may be just ways that we can distract ourselves, stop ourselves getting bored, for example. And I think, and they're very handy in that way. They require us to be passive. We can, stay in our living rooms without engaging in things. Again, they can just duplicate in a perhaps more exciting way briefly our pre-existing habits, rather than unstick us from the preoccupations or the habitual thought patterns that you talked about earlier.
Yeah. No,
there's that danger.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions here, and about bad trips. And maybe this is something where you have something to. I know in some of your descriptions in 10 trips, they're not all glorious journeys of beautiful discoveries.
Yeah.
So the question is, do we understand enough about the causes of bad trips? Can they be attributed to adulteration, or can it be actually dangerous for some people with some psychological issues? And if so, who? What do we know about bad trips?
Well, we know that they're far more common than was initially. Say in 2018, when Michael Pollan was reporting on the evidence, they were very much underreported. Since then, there's been sort of quite a significant and important research done on just how widespread bad trips can be. And I think the global ayahuasca survey of 11,000 participants indicated that more than 10% of people have what they call a serious adverse experience during an ayahuasca ceremony. So that's a real clinical risk. That's a very significant portion of people. What causes a bad trip is still, very much under researched, but there's definitely, already we know that certain diagnoses, particularly psychotic diagnoses, are increased risk factors. The nature of the setting clearly has an impact. I certainly had a bad experience where the facilitator was clearly not of sound mind himself, and was talking messianically about his ability to, however bad things got, they would be redeemed by his messianic knowledge. So I think there's something, there's a lot of psychedelic experiences are taking place in uncontrolled environments, which certainly is a cause for risk. But even in controlled environments, there's been an under-acknowledgement of risk so far, for sure.
Isn't there a deeper question here about what is a bad trip and what is bad about a bad trip? There's another thing
Absolutely.
that you write in your book, which I think it's a sort of more general quote that's always in the air in psychedelic discussions, which is that you get the trip that you need, not the trip that you want. And is there not the possibility that what may be an unpleasant, very unpleasant experience, a bad trip, which is scary and disturbing and distressing in very many ways, might actually be therapeutically, if integrated in the right way afterwards, might be exactly what the person needs in order to make progress psychologically. I know in my own experience, one of my psychedelic experiences would definitely be described as a bad trip, but it's actually one that I look back on as being one of the most positively transformative, in part because of the way I discussed it and talked about it afterwards.
I think that's certainly true, and I think something even more fundamental than that, perhaps, which is, and this is something that comes through strongly in a lot of your work, is that you are making a decision about, as I said earlier, a trip is constituted by 1,000,000 billion bits of information. So to say a bad trip means that you've smoothed out all of that information into one account, and you are probably doing that during the trip. So there's something about how your expectations or your decisions about an experience are then shaping what's to come, rather than that kind of more equanimous ability to decide what something is as it's occurring, rather than preordaining it via priors.
Yeah. No, that makes sense. Yeah. And I mean, this does get back to the role of expectations in shaping all of these things, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And yeah, I remember, I think, I thought about this a lot, but in a couple of my experiences, I wasn't aware of quite how many expectations and sort of not only about the experience, but about my reasons for doing it, my reasons to be there. These are all parts of expectations that you bring as well.
Yeah.
And I was sort of bringing tons of these things to this
Right.
context, and that was problematic.
I mean, I think this is where, I mean, forgive me for saying this, but just as risk has been under nuanced, then the idea of set and setting and intentionality, which are all kind of commonplaces in psychedelic circles, are just understood. There's not sufficient nuance in what constitutes a set, how expectations interweave everything, and may play a huge role, or perhaps no role at all, in intentionality, for example.
Yeah. No, I completely agree. So we're coming, I think we got 1 minute left before the top of the hour. What's your favorite psychedelic?
For me, it was Wachuma, mescaline, and it was the sort of least visual one, but it just felt like my whole body turned into a heart, and everything that I saw somehow revealed itself as just what it was. There was nothing complicated about it. It was just a direct connection. What about you?
I think it was LSD. I haven't tried as many as you have.
Okay.
But just the overwhelming perceptual beauty of that experience and transformational ego was just wonderful. Yeah. Good. I think we're at the end. I apologize to everyone who asked questions we didn't get to. I didn't realize how hard it would be to keep talking to Andy while trying to read questions. It's dual tasking, and so some of the longer questions didn't get asked purely because I couldn't concentrate long enough to read them while still listening to what we were talking about. But thank you for asking them. There's lots of fascinating questions here, and I hope our discussion shed at least a little bit of light on the issues. Thank you. Thanks, Andy.
Thanks very much, Anil. Thanks, everyone.
Neil, thank you so much. That was fascinating. And you've given us so many new ways to think about these questions, these big questions. So really, thank you. Thank you so much for this evening. And thank you, everyone, for attending. Remember that you can order copies of Andy and Anil's books from Newham Bookshop. Details about how to do that are available in the chat. And we'll be back next week with our first of a new series with Kew Gardens and Rathbones. We have a panel on health and nature with Anne Bickley and David Montgomery, among other excellent speakers. So please join us for that. That's next Monday at 6:30. Andy, Anil, thank you so much. Good evening, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.